Okay, and now it's time for our weekend recap. We're going to start off with the 140-pound contest between Chantelle Cameron and Sanchez, a fight where there was a mandatory slot on the line for the victor being Chantelle Cameron, to get a crack at what is Jessica McCaskill's green belt. As far as the aesthetic of this fight, it was everything I envisioned, though Chantelle didn't get the stoppage, came very close, and I believe it was the 9th and 10th rounds. Sanchez was worse for wear, though credit to her for finishing the fight on her feet because she absorbed some very hard shots. And if you've been watching the development of Chantelle Cameron, you'll have noticed some of her trademarks. You know, she fights off that jab,
doesn't abandon it,
uses it as both an offensive and defensive tool. This is how she's multifaceted, multi-dimensional, and able to move seamlessly between offensive fighting and defensive fighting. She's just as good on the front foot as she is on the back foot. In that way, Chantelle Cameron, more and more, is becoming a well-rounded fighter. You'll notice throughout the course of the match how Chantelle Cameron would gesture with the left hand while not actually shooting it. She'd gesture with it first, then fire off the shot. This would warrant a defensive response from Sanchez. This would get her to cover up, thereby allowing Chantelle to, after shooting that jab, step into the punch and start letting her hands go. So there's a very nuanced way for Chantelle to get within range, get within her desired range, to land the kind of punches that she wants to land without fear of getting hit with a shot coming through the front door. You can get your opponent to keep their guns holstered and step safely within range. Now you're cooking with rice. And this denotes what I talked about in my prediction video, how I didn't think that Chantelle would languish with as much as Jessica did because, well, Chantelle has a more layered approach. She's not just going to come busting through the front door the way that Jessica did. You know, as a result of that, Jessica got hit with some very hard shots. She languished a bit. She's an opponent with an approach that's a little easier to read, though not always easy to work around. But better still, you get a good sense of what Jessica's trying to do, whereas with Chantelle, there's a little bit more nuance, a little bit more finesse, a little bit more craftsmanship. Chantelle's variety of punches was also very noteworthy. You know, she has a varying attack that goes from the head to the body, gaining safe entry, getting within range in a variety of ways. You know, she's not just getting within range behind her jab. At times, Chantelle will fire a lead hook or a lead uppercut. Not everybody has the right ingredients to be successful with those kinds of shots. It takes a certain level of athleticism, a certain level of speed, and most importantly, a certain level of timing. That if that lead hook or that lead uppercut is to find a home, you've got to time it properly. That's because if you don't, if you're not careful, you could fire that shot, end up missing, and end up paying for it. For an example, I give to you the fight between Chris Eubank Jr. and George Groves. That was a fight where Chris Eubank Jr. showed nothing semblant of a jab, and his methodology to get within range was to consistently fire lead hooks. Lead hooks that read as more of an act of frustration as opposed to strategy, that you're not actually timing these hooks, and these hooks, well, they're not actually finding a home.
They're repetitive.
They are telegraphed, and in that way, they can be anticipated, thus worked around. Whereas in the case of Chantelle, she switches it up. Whether she's going up top, downstairs, and how she's going up top and downstairs, it all varies depending on the situation. Sometimes she'll come in behind her jab, other times she'll fire a lead hook upstairs or a lead uppercut downstairs. Keeps the opponent guessing, keeps the opponent wondering what she's going to do next, thereby creating an air of spontaneity, an air of confusion. You're just not quite sure what she's going to do next, and that plays into Chantelle's hands. Prevents her from becoming predictable. I want to say that if Chantelle Cameron didn't get the stoppage and the fight ended up going to the cards, I think that, you know, it's not that Chantelle's not a power puncher or that her power isn't as advertised, so much as perhaps I underestimated Sanchez's craftsmanship and her punch resistance, because so far she's been in there with Jessica McCaskill and Chantelle Cameron, two very strong punchers who have a tendency to be aggressive, and so far, you know, she showed toughness. She finished the fight on her feet. So I think that if Chantelle didn't get the stoppage, it's not because her power isn't as advertised. Maybe Anaí is just a bit tougher than I gave her credit for. I mean, Anaí Sanchez isn't half bad herself. You'll notice that in the exchange, as the fighters are trading, she is staying off the center line.
That's smart.
Throwing punches at an angle as to not get caught
being too upright.
And if a shot just so happened to get through, Anaí Sanchez instinctively knew to use the whole ring. Use those legs, get the fuck out of Dodge. Buy yourself some time to recompose yourself. So I think that, you know, between the toughness and craftsmanship of Anaí Sanchez and the multi-layered approach of Chantelle Cameron. The aesthetic of the fight was what I envisioned. It's just that it didn't end how I envisioned. But all things considered, it's clear Chantelle Cameron victory. I mean, you can't argue that. And with that, Chantelle Cameron has effectively become the mandatory challenger to the green belt at 140 pounds. 140 pounds where Jessica is the unified champion. I want to say that I'm a fan of both of these fighters, so I don't have a pony in the show. I'm not preferential to one more than the other. And with those things in mind, Chantelle Cameron is a risky fight for Jessica. She really is. She is
A live animal.
a clear and apparent threat to Jessica McCaskill's reign as a unified champion. With that, Chantelle Cameron has effectively arrived in the 140-pound division, and she appears to be everybody's fucking problem. Congratulations to Chantelle Cameron. We then turn to the top-ranked card, which featured WBO Super Featherweight Champion Jamel Herring in defense of that WBO title against the challenger, Lamont Roach. And the aesthetic of this fight and the outcome was more or less what I predicted. I predicted that Jamel Herring would win the fight on points, behind mobility, behind his jab, maintaining distance and spacing. You see, Jamel Herring, you can look at these two guys, Jamel Herring, Lamont Roach, and you can see that Jamel Herring is the more statuesque fighter in the fight, but he's not just some tall guy. You know, he's not some big-for-nothing guy. He uses that height. He's a jabber, and on top of being a jabber, he's a southpaw, okay? A southpaw with a good set of legs that he uses to maintain distance, maintain spacing while working off the jab. For Lamont Roach, who's a smaller guy, you know, it's an uphill battle because you got to get within range of this statuesque jabber just to get any work done. And what makes this a precarious and difficult situation for Lamont Roach in particular is that he's not really an aggressive guy. He's not really a come-forward, front-foot pressure fighter. Oh, granted that he's good mid-range to inside. He actually has good speed, good sharpness, and good combinations there. But as far as getting to that point, getting within that desired range, he's missing a few key ingredients. And it's that he's not that herky-jerky, fighting on a swivel, front-foot pressure guy. He's just not that guy. I want to talk about something I mentioned in my prediction video, that Jamel Herring strikes me as a more well-rounded and complete fighter than Lamont Roach, because Lamont Roach looks like a guy who's still working things out, whereas Jamel seems more or less like a more finished product. And it's because certain of Jamel Herring's implementation, his attributes, what tools he has in the tool bag, certain of these things complement each other and work in unison to round him out. What am I talking about? I'm talking about how he's statuesque for the super featherweight division. This is a tall guy with a long jab that he effectively fights behind. He's also got a good set of legs to help maintain that distance relative to him and his opponent. Just as well, he's a counterpuncher. So if a guy just so happens to get under and or around that jab, Jamel can still make him pay for it. He can still assert himself. Whereas in the case of Lamont Roach, you got a guy who's pretty good mid-range to inside, but his problem is getting there, you know? That he's not really aggressive. He's not really a front foot guy. And he's not that big a puncher either. So even if he does get within his desired range, it's still going to take some doing round after round for him to, you know, get some respect from the other guy. You know, you might have noticed in the Jonathan Oquendo fight, Jonathan Oquendo was getting all in his wheelhouse, okay? Lamont Roach struggled to get any kind of respect from that guy. In this situation where Lamont is facing a statuesque jabber who just so happens to be a southpaw, pretty educated counterpuncher, got some good check hooks as well, it's an uphill battle because you're not a complete enough fighter yet to where it's all going to come together. You know, you want to get within range of this guy. Your problem is you're not a pressure guy. It doesn't come naturally to you. You're pretty good mid-range to inside. You got some sharp movements, some good combinations, but the problem is, how are you going to get there? Certain
Ingredients.
of the necessary tools, the necessary characteristics that Lamont would have needed for this fight, well, that's just not his area of expertise. That relentless pace that most pressure fighters tend to have, constantly coming after the other guy, doubling up on the jab, then veering off to the left as to fire the right, while simultaneously staying off the center line. This really isn't Lamont Roach's area of expertise. Thus, he strikes me as an incomplete fighter that doesn't have all the fluidity that he would have needed ahead of this fight. I felt comfortable that Jamel Herring can win this fight on points because this opens the door for him to fight his fight, that he is the more complete package as opposed to Lamont Roach, who I'm not trying to sell short, I'm not trying to knock, just saying ahead of this fight I figured, you know, Jamel's got what it takes to win it, that's what he did. And that's not saying that Lamont Roach didn't have some nominal success in spots, that he didn't have moments in the fight. He did, but it's going to just take more than sparse moments to win a 12-round match, a 12-round world title fight. So congratulations to Jamel Herring on getting the job done. I felt he could. He proceeded to call out the WBC champion, Miguel Berchelt, who still doesn't seem very interested in unifying titles. I don't know why. I mean, if you're willing to stay in a division to fight Oscar Valdez, who has no world title, why would unifying with Jamel Herring seem like small potatoes?
I don't know.
He's done more at 130 than Oscar has, but, you know, that's the story until further notice. I just don't know what it's going to take to change his mind. I mean, Miguel Berchelt is the consensus number one in the super featherweight division. He does have a very good resume, some very good wins on there, but at the end of the day, it really is going to feel like he's got unfinished business if he just so happens to, you know, fight Oscar Valdez, then subsequently moves up and never unifies with any of the world champions at 130, even though there was at least one on his side of the street. Stands to reason that if you can have a fight like that, why wouldn't you? It certainly would grab people's attention. Nevertheless, congratulations to the reigning WBO super featherweight champion, Jamel Herring. I felt he had what it took to successfully retain that title, and that's exactly what he did. We then move on to a bit of news that was released a day or so ago, that apparently Daniel Jacobs has split from Andre Rozier, and I didn't even see this coming. I didn't even know that there was any trouble in the proverbial paradise, but according to Andre Rozier, it's over, and he doesn't even want Daniel Jacobs back in his gym. This was his response to potentially burying the hatchets and you know, maybe making amends. He doesn't want Daniel Jacobs in his gym. He talked about the previous camp, which was the camp for the Canelo Alvarez fight, how these guys were butting heads, and how people were telling Andre that, you know, if he decides to walk out on Daniel Jacobs ahead of the fight, you know, before the fight takes place, if Daniel falters, people are going to blame him for it. So he decided to go through with the fight. He was in his corner.
Stayed the course.
But as far as the future and moving forward, that's it. He's done with Daniel Jacobs. He highlighted some very intriguing, revealing talking points, that he thinks that Daniel Jacobs isn't hungry, you know, that he's coasting, as it were, off his reputation, and that any fighter who thinks that he's quote-unquote God's gift, you know, you got another thing coming, basically. Very revealing stuff. He even said that on the right night, basically, you know, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing here, but the article is up for you to read it, the highlighted portions. He even said that on the right night, Julio Cesar Chavez might actually get the best of Daniel Jacobs. And I'll tell you that there's more to discussing this story than the varying grotesqueries of what is now a fractured relationship between a fighter and his former trainer. There's more to it. There's more here to discuss and think about and reflect upon than just the he said, she said stuff. There is the matter of, okay, so what should we expect to see from Daniel Jacobs? Because whoever he winds up with, he's going to be in an experimental phase. Thus, the Daniel Jacobs we've been seeing fight by fight and what characteristics we've become accustomed to seeing, well, that might change because he's going to be with a different guy, different trainer, different tutelage, maybe different implementation. I mean, Daniel Jacobs is a comfortable pick, or at least he was a couple of days ago, to beat the likes of a Julio Cesar Chavez. But it does kind of change things if we find out that Daniel's in an experimental phase, that he's parted ways with Andre Rozier. Sure, the first reaction to this news that most people had is the glass house thesis. But not too long ago, we saw both Andre Rozier and Daniel Jacobs poking fun at the split between Gennady Golovkin and Abel Sanchez, a split that, you know, at least reportedly, was motivated by money. And these two guys were talking like they're above that kind of stuff. They're above that kind of nonsense, right? Only for them to turn around and do the same thing, because Andre Rozier, he did mention money. He did say that, you know, money changes some people and some others it doesn't. I'm sure that had something to do with the split. And I'm sure that most people's reaction to this news is the glass house thesis, that it looks like Andre was throwing stones in a glass house. Yeah, apparently. But more immediate effect, you know, more attention should be paid to the immediate effect that this may have on the fighter and his future. Because what Andre Rozier is essentially saying is that Daniel Jacobs has become more concerned with the business of boxing as opposed to the sport of boxing. Because he's coasting. Because he's complacent, you know? You got to put the work in. You know, anybody thinking they're God's gift, you got to put the work in. What is Andre Rozier trying to communicate with these statements? that Daniel Jacobs isn't hungry anymore and he's just looking to cash out? He's trying to take a minimalist approach to what is a very aggressive and dangerous sport? What's he trying to imply? These are merely questions, ladies and gentlemen. Questions, not statements. These are questions that I have because, you look at what Daniel Jacobs said in regards to Gennady Golovkin parting ways with his trainer, how he just laughs at those kinds of situations because he's still there with the guy that's been there with him from day one. When he said these things, he was talking about Andre Rozier. But what do we see? What do we see? That he has so decided to potentially fracture a long-time working relationship with his long-time trainer for what appears to be money. Something along those lines. What does that say about the headspace of the fighter? Where is he psychologically? Because boxing is not a 9-to-5 job to where you can punch in a clock and do things half-heartedly. If Daniel Jacobs has become more invested in the business of boxing as to the sporting element of it, that could have catastrophic consequences. That suddenly a guy like Chavez might turn out to be more of a test for a fighter like that, as opposed to a guy who still wants to go out there and put on a performance, make a statement, build his legacy. It's a different mindset, different situations. And, I don't know. I'm very surprised that he parted ways with Andre Rozier, to be completely honest, because I think Andre Rozier is a damn good trainer. Maybe Daniel Jacobs feels he's gotten about as far as he can go with him. Could be that way. Maybe he feels there's no more growth to be had under his tutelage. One way or another, I think this is going to have an effect on the next chapter of Daniel Jacobs' career, whether it's a negative effect or a positive effect. We'll just have to wait and see.